capital with identification of capital. Initially, until
of empathy and identification. You could be the very...
Had I known that I was to produce identification before being let in, I would not.
Solidarity and identification with foreign peoples, minorities, women, this was all men in this experience.
In trying to give them an identification in that way, that
fraud identification and PCI support, as well as contact reduction and automation.
DNA is superior to other methods of identification because it gives us very...
You're being able to have empathic identification with the other. And when you look at the development, if you look at...
I think that there's a lot of identification of bubbles based on 2020 hindsight.
Italian American, but I'm an American, and that identification is sometimes difficult.
And the identification of genetic predispositions or overt genetic
does declare an error identification zone. These are symbolic but effective.
And I think that's what they probably mean by formal is that identification.
Yeah.
Why do I have to go through a process?
Repentance had nothing to do with identification with the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ, because that hadn't happened.
Full, yeah. Well, the kind of actually the identification we feel with the human.
ISIS and its radical Islamist ideology, identification of new coalition partners.
Could use for identification. So initially we were just going out and taking photographs, and we had a shoebox, literally.
Is to facilitate the identification and addressing of malware and threats.
Those are the renewable identification numbers that are created whenever ethanol.
Like, I had my whole fish identification down because as a kid, I knew what I wanted for dinner and I knew how to put in my...
Particularly in emerging infections, identification of pathogens and surveillance intervention. So it's very exciting to imagine.
If you know this, but there are a lot of mean people out there who use Jesus' name as their identification. And about 7 years ago, I sat down with...
Our understanding of skeletal shape and species identification kind of had to be
right through object identification, and that type of object identification builds visual vocabulary.
Appealing to people through stories, through identification, through emotion.
Pre-existing forms of identification that an icon has, the built-in audio.
And I think the over-identification certainly was present then. And
you talk about over-identification.
Category. It was a religious identification that didn't even align with
nation. Enable identification of business and community development needs. Ensure regulatories have the ability.
About finding points of identification as an essential motive for attempting to
be shooting the actual identification of Earth's twin in the foot.
Then we have greetings and identification. You could all hear that Nancy's hi.
We had plant and animal identification classes last fall. We went on a field trip to the bird refuge.
As well as undertaking the